Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is fall of 2019. Recently, the United States Attorney General Bill Barr gave a speech at Notre Dame. And in this speech, he said some very, very interesting things. Now, I don't know how much he actually means all of this. Sometimes people are a lot more talk than they are action. That part will remain to be seen. Of course, there is a major ongoing investigation at this point where the Obama administration was actually spying on a number of different candidates for the office of President of the United States. And I think ultimately that's where the whole investigation will lead. I think because it's too politically sensitive because of who Obama was and so on, that they won't directly point fingers at him, but it will be obvious that that's where all of the commands and orders were actually coming from. They were not flowing from low-level people like Brennan and Clapper and people like that. This was all an Obama deal, totally, and it was because he was trying to help the Democrats win the presidency overall. Even though he doesn't particularly like the Clintons, from what I can gather, he still wanted Hillary to win, obviously. So overall, the thing that he was trying to focus on was religious liberty in America. And he says that is a specific point of emphasis for the current administration and this Department of Justice. We come down here where he says this: we keep an eye out for cases or events around the country where states are misapplying the Establishment Clause in a way that discriminates against people of faith, or cases where states adopt laws that impinge upon the free exercise of religion. Now, the place where people get this idea is actually in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Church from Thomas Jefferson. There's actually nothing in the Constitution that specifically says there has to be a separation of church and state. But people are always taught wrong in K through 12 education, and of course at the university level as well. So because of this miseducation of the masses that always happens, people think that no one can ever, as a member of government, display any interest or knowledge about religion in any way whatsoever unless they are there to specifically denigrate it. And leftists even have this very bizarre interpretation that, let's say that a person at least proclaims to be religious, like George Bush. I don't think the guy was particularly Christian in any way whatsoever, but if he just said so, they would act like that was the government trying to impose religion upon them, which of course it is not. We come down here to this portion here. He says, the imperative of protecting religious freedom was not just a nod in the direction of piety. He's talking about the Founding Fathers here. It reflects the framers' belief that religion was indispensable to sustaining our free system of government, because they did operate under the belief that a religious people would be a moral people, and this sort of government that they were trying to set up would be unfit for any other kind of people. They certainly never foresaw the ultimate victory of secularism or the secularists, even though they were already examples of this process of secularization. And here I will cite again for you to please purchase and read Dr. Christian Smith's book about this, about the 500-year process of secularization and its impact on our society today, so that you can understand what has happened, how it has happened, and who has been behind leading it over the years. We come down here a bit where he calls the Constitution a magnificent charter of freedom. You wouldn't think that today, though. If you listen to the left, it's wholly inadequate, because they are obsessed with what they call all sorts of racism and bigotry and misogyny and all these other things that they've come up with over the years in order to fracture the public. We go down a bit further here where he says that we face entirely different kinds of challenges today. He says here that the founders never believed that the main danger would be from the inside, that it always would be from external foes. So what he's pointing to here is the United States actually has internal foes who want to basically bring this country down, to break it apart, to tear it up, to burn the entire thing down. He talks here about how the founding generation's view of human nature was drawn from the classical Christian tradition. And that is, of course, true. However, many of the founders were actually simply deists, and deists had a very a weak version of God, basically a divine clockmaker sort of God who sort of wound things up, put it into place, and then sat back and really didn't do much of anything else. And I've talked about that in a previous episode that I did on natural theology. I'll link that below. It talks about some of the promises and peril, the strengths and weaknesses of natural theology. Here he talks about how He says men, which would, of course, trigger a bunch of SJWs, but really, of course, what he means there is the universal human are subject to powerful passions and appetites, which is always true. Evil will always tell you to simply give into or even indulge the powerful passions and appetites. And I think there's numerous examples of that kind of behavior out there today. He refers here to individual rapacity and licentiousness, the unbridled pursuit of personal appetites at the expense of the common good. I'm, however, when it comes to ethics, not much of one to talk about this concept of the common good. I think that we have to begin with a universal form of ethics, and then ultimately that will bring about this common good. I don't think that we ever focus on whatever this idea of the common good is first and foremost, because then individual ethics tends to get smashed underneath it all, usually by a giant statist system. Here he goes on to quote Edmund Burke. He says, summed up this point in his typically colorful language, quote, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put chains on their appetites. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power be placed somewhere, and the less of it there is within, the more there must be without. It is ordained in the eternal constitution of things that men of intemperate minds cannot be free. Their passions forge their fetters." That's exactly what I think of, too, when I see these Antifa lunatics running loose in the streets, cracking people over the head. We come down here a bit further. He's talking about the social order, how it must flow up from the people themselves, freely obeying the dictates of inwardly possessed and commonly shared moral values. And that's one of the things we're lacking right now, is we do not have commonly shared moral values. And to control willful human beings with an infinite capacity to rationalize, those moral values must rest on authority independent of men's will. They must flow from a transcendent supreme being. And of course, this transcendent supreme being language here, though, strikes me so much more as the founder's deist concept. But I know what he's trying to do here. You know, he's trying to be ecumenical and reach across the Catholic-Protestant divide, which is always a sort of a difficult one to do in America. He continues here, in short, in the framers' view, free government was only suitable and sustainable for a religious people, a people who recognized that there was a transcendent moral order, antecedent to both the state and man-made law, and who had the discipline to control themselves according to those enduring principles. And that's one of the things that the left resolutely rejects today. They think that any sort of freedoms that you have, all laws that you have, flow from the state first of all, right? Any morality that you have only comes from the state. There's not anything that pre-exists that. And of course, you can see what the danger is with that if you use logic and reason just for a few moments. You see that, well, then the state can always change what is moral and what is not moral and then impose that on everyone. And that is very dangerous, of course, if you're dealing with people who get in charge of the state like Stalin or Mao or Hitler and so on and so forth. We come down here a bit more. He says, as John Adams put it, quote, "We have no government armed with a power which is capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." We come down here a bit further where he says, the founding generation were Christians. They believed that the Judeo-Christian moral system, of course, that'll trigger a whole lot of people who hate Israel and Jews, and they're very anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. You're hearing a whole lot of this stuff lately about this total rejection of the Judeo-Christian term, which is fine, whatever. I mean, it doesn't affect me either way. You can take it or leave it. You could just say Christian moral system if you wish. Corresponds to the true nature of man. Those moral precepts start with the two great commandments, to love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. But they also include the guidance of natural law, a real transcendent moral order which flows from God's eternal law, the divine wisdom by which the whole of creation is ordered. The eternal law is impressed upon and reflected in all created things. Of course, too, you have to keep in mind that the fall actually took place and it damaged all of these things. Now, it didn't damage them irreparably, but it did do damage to all of these things. That's part of what is meant by fallen man. He continues here, from the nature of things we can, through reason and experience, discern standards of right and wrong that exist independent of human will. Modern secularists dismiss this idea of morality as otherworldly superstition imposed by killjoy clergy. In fact, Judeo-Christian moral standards are the ultimate utilitarian rules for human conduct. And once again, I reject that because I am against utilitarianism. He continues down here where he points out the dangers of not abiding by these. He says, by the same token, violations of these moral laws have bad real-world consequences for man and society. We may not pay the price immediately, but over time the harm is real. A bit further down here, he says, I think we all recognize that over the past 50 years, religion has been under increasing attack. And I would expand that with another 0 there and say it goes back 500 years. We're really only seeing the tail end of a much longer and deeper process that's been taking place in the Western world. And then a bit further down here, he points out that we see the growing ascendancy of secularism and the doctrine of moral relativism, which of course very strongly goes together. They're not necessarily logically linked, but the way that it happens in reality is that most people who are secularists will then subscribe to some forms of moral relativism or ethical subjectivism. We come down here a bit more. He says, in 1965, the illegitimacy rate was 8%. This, of course, goes back to Kinsey. I've done lots of different episodes where I talk about Kinsey, and I show these illegitimacy rates and divorce rates and all of that. In 1992, when I was last Attorney General, it was 25%. Today, it is over 40%. In many of our large urban areas, it is around 70%. And this, of course, is pointing out the dangers of these single-mom homes where things get rampantly out of control and turn to lots of violence and dangerous circumstances. He continues, along with the wreckage of the family, we are seeing record levels of depression and mental illness, dispirited young people, soaring suicide rates, increasing numbers of angry and alienated young males, an increase in senseless violence, and a deadly drug epidemic. And these are the fruits of what he was talking about before, of secularism and moral relativism. They almost directly lead to these kinds of things because these people are just rootless, directionless, and they have no idea what they should do with their life. Come down here a bit further. He says, I will not dwell on all the bitter results of the new secular age. And this is a reference to what you see on the dollar bill, the Annuit Coepidus Novus Ordo Seclorum, right? Announcing the birth or arrival of the new secular order, which some people then truncate and just call the New World Order. But really, the New World Order in this sense is nothing more than this globalism that we've seen both the neocons and neoliberals and globalists all agreeing on the same way that the world ought to be ran, and they always end up going towards these global institutions like the UN as the model for how it should be done. But lately it seems that they are more and more favoring the Chinese model of just outright total spying, surveillance on everybody, suppression of everybody. He continues, suffice it to say that the campaign to destroy the traditional moral order has brought with it immense suffering, wreckage, and misery, and yet the forces of secularism, ignoring these tragic results, press on with even greater militancy. Yeah, and this is what you see them do repeatedly, is they think that despite all the bad things that happen, well, if we just ram more and more and more of it down people's throats, well, then somehow that's going to end up with good results. They never step back and say, hey, are we doing something really wrong here? Does this actually work or does it not work? He continues here, he says, among these militant secularists are many so-called progressives, but where is the progress? Great question. He says here, we are told we are living in a post-Christian era, but what has replaced the Judeo-Christian moral system? What is it that can fill the spiritual void in the hearts of the individual person? And what is a system of values that can sustain human social life? The fact is that no secular creed has emerged capable of performing the role of a religion. And this is why you see them replace it with crazy things like the New Green Deal, and they're obsessed with cow farts and ending planes and boats and cars and coal and oil and gas and all this other crazy nonsense that you see the left into all the time. And then you'll see Greta Thunberg running around with Leonardo DiCaprio, who is regularly on huge yachts that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and completely destroy the environment, as he is always out there banging models and taking private jet flights all across the world in order to accept awards for his so-called concern with the environment. These people are just totally hypocritical, as I've said before, complete ignorant, vacuous, air-headed dimwits, okay? Yes, he's a great actor. Yes, people think that he's handsome. But other than that, he's an absolute idiot, a complete fool, a liar, and a fraud. We come down here a bit more where he says, we hear much today about our humane values, but in the final analysis, what undergirds these values? What commands our adherence to them? And I would say there's nothing. There's just this sort of whim-based, wishy-washy, ever-changing thing. I mean, it literally changes month to month, day to day, even minute to minute. They may have a whole new set of values. Some other thing is going to immensely offend somebody, and for some reason, we're always supposed to be so concerned with the emotions of the offended. But what about everybody else who's offended by those fools, those idiots? Does nobody care about those emotions? No, they're just dismissed as reactionaries. And he really nails it here again when he says, what we call, quote, values today are really nothing more than mere sentimentality, still drawing on the vapor trails of Christianity. Now I'm going to move down here a bit where he makes several really, really good points. First is the force, fervor, and comprehensiveness of the assault on religion we are experiencing today. This is not decay, it is organized destruction. Secularists and their allies among the so-called progressives, in quotes, have marshaled all the force of mass communications, popular culture, the entertainment industry, and academia in an unremitting assault on religion and traditional values. And this is what I always tell you, when you see Hollywood, when you see TV, when you see film, they are attacking these traditional values constantly, unremittingly, just as he says here. K through 12 education is totally controlled by leftists. It doesn't matter if there's a conservative president who then puts a conservative in control of the Department of Education if every other person inside the Department of Education doesn't listen to what that person says, and they're all leftists and they're all secularists and they're all progressives, okay? Same thing goes for university level education. They're all on the left. They are almost all secularists, okay? Huge numbers, 80, 85%, 90%. It depends on what area you're looking at, but I've covered all those numbers in the past. There absolutely is no debating this, okay? Conservatives or Christian values do not get representation in these places. It just doesn't happen. He goes on here, these instruments are used not only to affirmatively promote secular orthodoxy, but also drown out and silence opposing voices, and to attack viciously and uphold to ridicule any dissenters. One of the ironies, as some have observed, is that the secular project has itself become a religion, pursued with religious fervor. It is taking on all the trappings of a religion, including inquisitions and excommunication. Those who defy the creed risk a figurative burning at the stake, social, educational, and professional ostracism, an exclusion waged through lawsuits and savage social media campaigns. The pervasiveness and power of our high-tech popular culture fuels apostasy in another way. It provides an unprecedented degree of distraction. Part of the human condition is that there are big questions that should stare us in the face. Are we created, or are we purely material accidents? Does our life have any meaning or purpose? But as Blaise Pascal observed, instead of grappling with these questions, humans can easily be distracted from thinking about the final things. Yeah, they're obsessed with when's the next iPhone coming out, what is the next movie or TV show that's coming out, did Kim Kardashian's boob flop out on Instagram or something like that. It's just all this mindless, stupid nonsense. Did somebody say something offensive somewhere? We've got to go get them and take them down and destroy their life. Even Obama, of all people, has spoken out against this lately, although I think he needs to go talk to his wife because she's not listening to what he's talking about, plainly. She's constantly out there race baiting and all this other stuff, which of course he spent an entire 8 years doing himself. And it was politically brilliant, and that's one thing I'll always give Obama credit for. Politically, he was an incredible strategist. Very, very, very intelligent dude. We come down here and we see some of the results of this so-called progressivism and secularism. He says, so the reaction to growing illegitimacy is not sexual responsibility, but abortion. Got a baby? Just kill it.
We keep the babies alive after they're born and have a discussion. They are getting caught now because we've decompartmentalized.
Didn't see that,
keep them comfortable.
But I am very, very concerned with late-term abortions.
We don't want, it's a 3-minute clip, pull it up. We don't want the government involved, the doctors and the mother who's drugged up. You didn't say that.
Virginia's governor says he has no regrets on his comments earlier this week defending abortion, even as a baby is being born.
The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother.
He goes, well, sometimes the baby is deformed. No, they want the organs. If they can kill a baby after it's born, because sometimes they deformed. No, see, sometimes they deform.
The reaction to drug addiction is safe injection sites. The solution to the breakdown of the family is for the state to set itself up as the ersatz husband for single mothers and the ersatz father to their children. The call comes for more and more social programs to deal with the wreckage. While we think we're solving problems, we are underwriting them. Of course, this is the entire Cloward and Piven intent, right? To put stress on the system so that leftism will reign and things will go more and more towards communism and socialism. He says here we start with an untrammeled freedom and we end up as dependents of a coercive state on which we depend. That's the entire point. That's why all these things are going on. Now, regular leftists or people who just vote straight Democratic tickets often don't understand all these things. You know, all of this stuff is being orchestrated, okay, by an intellectual class that's actually thought it out as to how this should take place. Now, the regular person who just votes Dem doesn't know that's going on. Continue down here a bit further. He says the new secular religion teaches macro morality. One's morality is not gauged by their private conduct, but rather on their commitment to political causes and collective action to address social problems. This system allows us not to worry so much about the strictures of our own private lives while we find salvation on the picket line. We can signal our finely tuned moral sensibilities by demonstrating for this cause or that. That's the virtue signaling thing. Down a bit further, a third phenomenon which makes it difficult for the pendulum to swing back is the way the law is being used as a battering ram to break down traditional moral values and to establish moral relativism as a new orthodoxy. And there are entire legal departments that are totally focused on just this thing, and of course money flowing in from George Soros to take over various DA's offices so that he can impose that kind of moral value system on the rest of us. And we come down here a bit further, and this is something that was actually pointed out in Dr. Benjamin Weiker's book called Worshipping the State, which is one that he shows there that it's almost a necessary consequence of the system that was set up here in the United States that it would ultimately go in this direction. So Barr says here, the problem is not that religion is being forced on others. The problem is that irreligion and secular values are being forced on people of faith. And that is, of course, what will happen when you have a necessary separation of church and state. What that ultimately means is that the church will be subordinate to the state. And Barr says here, this reminds me of how some Roman emperors could not leave their loyal Christian subjects in peace, but would mandate that they violate their conscience by offering religious sacrifice to the emperor as a god. Similarly, militant secularists today do not have a live and let live spirit, right? This is why the non-aggression principle and libertarianism can't work in the current system that we have, because they do not have the idea of this live and let live, right? Which is what libertarianism ideally is supposed to be. They are not content to leave religious people alone to practice their faith. Instead, they seem to take a delight in compelling people to violate their conscience, and that is exactly what they want to do. They love to do this. I'm going to jump down here a bit more because he finally starts to touch on something that I talk about constantly on this show. He says here, because this administration firmly supports accommodation of religion, the battleground has shifted to the states. Some state governments are now attempting to compel religious individuals and entities to subscribe to practices or to espouse viewpoints that are incompatible with their religion. And I think I've covered a number of episodes here where you know what he's getting at. Ground zero for these attacks on religion are the schools. To me, this is the most serious challenge to religious liberty. And to me, ultimately, this is where all control has been lost. It's everything is leftist in the school systems, K through 12 and university level. And we come down here into this section, and this is where Dr. Duke Pesta is really good on these issues. I'll link his YouTube site below. He says here, the first front relates to the content of public school curriculum. Many states are adopting curriculum that is incompatible with traditional religious principles according to which parents are attempting to raise their children. They often do so without any opt-out for religious families. So they do impose these views, these anti-Christian views on the children. Thus, for example, New Jersey recently passed a law requiring public schools to adopt an LGBT curriculum that many feel is inconsistent with traditional Christian teaching. Similar laws have been passed in California and Illinois, and the Orange County Board of Education in California issued an opinion that, quote, parents who disagree with the instructional materials related to gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation may not excuse their children from this instruction, end quote. And of course, this is why I always point out the dangers with what they're trying to do with pedophilia, because they're trying to get that, conceived of as simply another sexual orientation, and then that way pedophilia will be taught to your children as just as ordinary and normal as anything else. But just because you're not thinking 10 steps ahead, don't think that the other side isn't, because they are. He says, indeed, in some cases, the schools may not even warn parents about the lessons they plan to teach on controversial subjects relating to sexual behavior and relationships. This puts parents who dissent from the secular orthodoxy to a difficult choice: try to scrape together the money for private school or homeschooling, or allow their children to be inculcated with messages that they fundamentally reject. He goes on to point out about how many of the states have cut the ability to get into private schools. They cut private school funding and all kinds of other measures. It's all done intentionally to advance this sort of progressive secularist worldview. Next, he says, a third kind of assault on religious freedom and education have been recent efforts to use state laws to force religious schools to adhere to secular orthodoxy. Again, this is the subordination of the church to the state. For example, right here in Indiana, a teacher sued the Catholic Archbishop of Indianapolis for directing the Catholic schools within his diocese that they could not employ teachers in same-sex marriages because the example of these same-sex marriages would undermine the school's teaching on the Catholic view of marriage and complementarity between the sexes. And then the rest of the wrap-up here is where he's, encouraging people to live, have the freedom in America to live according to their faith. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.